Hi, friends. How are you guys doing?
Hey João, hey Norah.
Hi, my friends. Everything is great. How about you?
Oh,
Oh, no.
João frozen.
Okay, well, all is well. Maybe he'll come back in a little bit.
Oh, so sorry, guys. I
Hey,
lost
he's
my
back.
internet connection, but I'm back. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah,
Oh,
loud and
so
clear.
sorry. I don't. It literally got out, but I'm back. So, friends, we're here to start the 19th day of this beautiful book, Paul and Stephen. We're very happy with this journey that we have been through this year. This book is amazing. We are in the second part, and tonight we're gonna carry on from where we stopped last week. Actually, the last time we recorded. I'm very happy to have my two great friends here with me. And before we start properly talking about the book, our great friend Nora, as always, will bring us some prayer so we can get more relaxed, calmer, and then start studying.
All right. Let us beautifully and calmly jump into this beautiful vibration, thanking God and the mentors for this opportunity to gather here this evening or on demand. We thank you so much for the blessing of life. We thank you so much for friendships, for family, for relationships, and just the blessing of being here. We thank you, and thank you. As we study tonight, that you inspire our hearts with beautiful message for our soul. And let us say the Hail Mary's prayer. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed are thy womb, Holy Mary, Mother of God. Pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. And so be
Thank you, dear. So
it.
much beautiful. So, guys, we're gonna carry on in the book in this first part as we've been doing, especially me bringing the text. And after all, after all of us have read here, we're gonna bring some comments as we've been doing. Okay. So, Sal understood the warning. There was no need to prolong the conversation. With good manners, his friend was throwing him out. This is where we stopped last week. 2 minutes later, Sal was back on the street. It was almost noon on a very hot day. He was thirsty and hungry. He looked in his pouch and it was almost empty. There was very little left from what he had received from Gamaliel's brother on leaving Palmyra for good. He looked for the cheapest inn in one of the poorest neighborhoods of the city. Then, after a frugal meal, and before the kerosene shadows of the afternoon began to fall, he walked full of hope toward the renovated old house where Simon Peter and his companions carried out their activities on behalf of Jesus' cause. On the way, he remembered when he had gone with Sadak to listen to Stephen, how everything was now happening in reverse. The critic of yesterday had now returned to be criticized. The judge turned defendant's heart was immersed in singular anxieties. How would they receive him at the church of the way? This is very powerful. Saul stopped in front of the humble house, immersed in the past, and with a heavy heart he thought of Stephen. When he had stood before his friends, before the authorities of Judaism at the Sanhedrin, his attitude had been otherwise. He knew their individual weakness since he too had donned the Pharisaical mask and could submerge their clamorous errors. However, now that he was about to face the Galilean apostles, his conscience was overcome with a sense of sacred veneration. These men might be unrefined and simple, and they might be living outside the intellectual values of the time, but they had been Jesus' first helpers. Moreover, he could not approach them without experiencing profound regret. All of them had suffered shame and humiliation because of him. If it had not been for Gamaliel, perhaps Peter himself would have been stoned. He needed to solidify his sentiments of humility in order to express his ardent desire for sacred cooperation with Christ. In Damascus, he had struggled in the synagogue against the hypocrisy of old friends. In Jerusalem, he had faced Alexander without fear. However, it seemed to him that his attitude here should be different, that he should renounce himself in order to be reconciled with those he had harmed. Deep in he thought, deep in he thought, he knocked on the door, almost trembling. Prochorus, one of the helpers who answered the door politely. Brother, said Sal humbly, could you please tell me if Peter is in? I'll check, he answered amicably. If he is, continued Saul, somewhat hesitant, tell him that Saul of Tarsus wishes to speak with him in Jesus' name. Prochorus went pale and shuddered and stuttered a yes, fixing his startled eyes on the visitor before leaving hesitantly, unable to disguise his great surprise. It was the persecutor. He had returned after 3 years. He now remembered Saul's first argument with Stephen when the great preacher of the gospel had suffered so many insults. In a few moments, he reached the room where Peter and John were discussing internal problems. The news hit them like an explosion. Nobody could have foreseen such a thing. They did not believe the story that Jerusalem had elaborated upon with unknown details at each telling. There was no way that the implacable persecutor of the Master's disciples had converted to the cause of his gospel of love and redemption. Before sending Prochorus back to the unexpected visitor, the former fisherman of the way called James so that all three could decide what to do. The son of a strict ascetic opened his eyes wide. After the first hurried exchange of justifiable, fear-filled opinions, Simon stated with great prudence, "It is true that Saul caused us all the harm he was capable of. However, it is not for ourselves that we should be afraid, but for the work of Christ that has been entrusted to us. I'll bet this whole story about his conversion is a farce to lead us into a new trap," said James, somewhat uneasily. "As for me," said John, "I pray to Jesus to enlighten us, even though I remember the whippings that Saul ordered to be inflicted on me in prison. Before anything else, we must find out if Christ did in fact appear to him at the gates of Damascus. But how can we find out?" asked Peter, with deep understanding. Our poor lies in Saul. Our proof lies in Saul himself. He is the field that will either reveal or not reveal the sacred seating of the Master. In my opinion, since we are in charge of a legacy that does not belong to us personally, we must proceed in accordance with human prudence. It would not be right to open our doors when we do not know his intentions. The first time he came here, Saul of Tarsus was treated with all the respect that the world accorded him. I offered the best seat for him to listen to Stephen. Unfortunately, his disrespectful and sarcastic attitude caused a scandal that ended in the imprisonment and death of our friend. He came intentionally and returned later to arrest us. He repaid our fraternal love with shekels and ropes. Having said that, however, I must not forget the Master's lesson regarding forgiveness, and so I would reaffirm the fact that I am not thinking only of ourselves, but the responsibilities that have been entrusted to us. The others were silent before such wise remarks, while the ex fisherman continued. Consequently, despite my willingness to do so, I cannot allow him to be received into this house without making a better study of the situation. That said, I shall call a meeting for tonight. The matter is very grave. Saul of Tarsus was the first persecutor of the gospel, and I want everyone's help in deciding what to do. I do not want to seem unjust or imprudent. And after a long pause, he said to Prochorus, "Go and tell him to come back later, that I cannot leave more urgent matter for the time being." "What if he insists?" asked the worried deacon. "If he has in fact come in the name of Jesus, he will understand and wait." Saul was anxiously awaiting the messenger's return. He had to find someone who could understand him and acknowledge his transformation. He was exhausted. The Church of the Way was his last hope. Prochorus delivered the message with utter hesitation. Saul understood the situation at once. The Galilean apostles did not believe him. This is actually sad. He now examined the situation more clearly and perceived the great and indefinable mercy of Christ visiting him unexpectedly at the deepest point of his spiritual abscess before the gates of Damascus. Judging from how very difficult it had been for him to meet Jesus, he realized how much kindness and compassion had been necessary for the Master to welcome him and address him with sacred exhortations during that unforgettable encounter. The deacon looked at him sympathetically. Saul received the reply highly disappointed. He went pale and shook as if he were ashamed of himself. Moreover, he looked ill, had sunken eyes, and was all skin and bone. "I understand, brother," he said, nearly in tears. "Peter is right." Those words moved Prochorus to the core of his soul, showing a willingness to help and demonstrating a full knowledge of the facts. He said, "Haven't you brought any sort of introduction from Ananias in Damascus?" "I already have the master's." "How so?" asked the deacon, surprised. "Jesus told me in Damascus," said Saul peacefully, "that he would show me how much I must suffer for the love of his name." Deep down, the former rabbi felt immensely homesick for the brothers of Damascus who had treated him with the greatest of simplicity. Nevertheless, he also realized that this was the right way to proceed for now, since he had given proof in the synagogue and to Ananias that his attitude left no room for pretense. Upon realizing that everyone in Jerusalem was receiving him as a common liar, he felt hot tears welling up in his eyes. But so that the deacon would not see his wounded sentiments, he made up the excuse. "My eyes have seen the Lord." The deacon complied immediately. In a few moments, Saul was immersing his hands in a large jar, washing his eyes in pure water. "I'll come back later," he said, shaking the hand of the deacon, who, impressed, went back inside. Suffering from physical weakness, fatigue, the abandonment of friends, and bitter disillusionment, Saul walked unsteadily away. At night, and as planned, Simon Peter, showing admirable good sense, gathered his companions to consider the matter. Besides the Galilean apostles, the meeting included the Nicanor brothers, Prochorus, Parmenas, Timon, Nicholas, and Barnabas. Barnabas was a member of the most direct helpers at the church because of the elevated qualities of his soul. With Peter's permission, James began the discussion. He was opposed to any kind of immediate help to the last minute convert. John then proffered the fact that Jesus had the power to transform the most evil spirits as well as to uplift the most unfortunate. Proctor spoke of his impressions regarding the obstinate persecutor of the gospel and emphasized the compassion that his state of health would awaken in the most unfeeling soul. Barnabas, in turn, told them that when he was still in Cyprus before moving permanently to Jerusalem, he had heard some Levites describing the courage with which the convert had spoken in the synagogue of Damascus soon after his vision of Jesus. Peter was impressed with Barnabas' opinion and asked for more details. He explained as much as he knew and asked for the issue to be resolved with the greatest benevolence. Here I finish and I pass to my brother. This is very emotional, guys. And I pass to my brother Daniel.
Thanks, João. So, as Peter and Barnabas were building an atmosphere of sympathy, Nicholas pointed out the maimed and the dead by the hands of Saul's henchmen. After all, Saul was a doctor of the law, fought everything and everyone who acted under Jesus' doctrine. He could be a wolf in sheep's clothing. Peter noticed the meeting was divided and recalled his mistakes in the past, like advising Jesus to stone an unfortunate and his denial on the master in his last hours. And yes, Saul could have been lying, which would picture him even more despicable than before. But since he was actually in need, no reason could be considered to refuse assistance. Peter noticed James was preparing to defend Nicholas' speech. Then he continued by remembering that Jesus recommended his disciples to be gentle as doves, but wise as serpents. What if Saul was actually a wolf in disguise? What could they do about it? Kill him. Goodness can't be held back by fear, and this is a very important phrase that I'd like to comment later. Um, James, and Nicholas were disarmed and silenced to cover the meeting. Peter then proposed the plan of sending Barnabas to meet Saul because they didn't know each other, and thus no bad feelings about Jerusalem would be triggered. And everybody agreed to that. Next morning, Barnabas went to meet Saul at the inn, and the man he saw was ill, displaying fatigue in every gesture. Great affinity was established between them after Saul telling about his journey and his vision of the Master. Barnabas paid Saul's expenses to the innkeeper and invited him to go to the Church of the Way. Saul hesitated, naturally, but Barnabas insisted, saying that Jesus helped us all because we need it, not because we deserved it. Saul was humble and ill. Barnabas could not associate him to that dreadful things he heard. Both headed towards the Church of the Way, and Saul was received right away, and Peter, surprised by his look, welcomed him in name of Jesus, engaged in a very important conversation. Saul told about his journey, recognized the harm he caused, and depicted the vision that converted him into a new man, aware of his spiritual needs. Next, he showed Le- Levi's, I don't know, Levi's parchment that Gamaliel gave him. That was enough to conquer the assistance he needed from the people he once presented. So this is so important, this parchment from Levi that everybody started to trust him and accept him inside the church. This house is yours too. This phrase from Peter summed up the purest Christian charity. And now I can pass the word to Nora. It was a bit fast, but that's it.
Wow, that just like wow, it just came in. So let me see if I can add the slides to the stream. Yeah, okay. Yay. All right, here we go. So we're just gonna read to continue off with the story. Their guest was very touched, remembering the past. He felt his self-esteem wounded, but at the same time he prayed to Jesus to help him not to disparage the opportunity to learn. So he says, I accept, he answered. I will stay with you while my health needs care. And as if having great difficulty in adding a request to the favor he had just accepted, after a long pause in which he was making an effort to speak, he asked movingly, if possible, I would like to occupy the same bed that Stephen slept in when he was generously sheltered in this house, which was like, wow. The first time I read that, I just stopped, like I couldn't believe it, right? And now we're going to see how this particular request helps him heal and understand different perspectives. It says here Barnabas and Peter were greatly moved. They all had agreed not to mention the preacher who had been slain under a hail of mockery and stones. They did not want to bring up the past in front of Damascus convert, even if his attitude turned. Um, Peter nearly wept at hearing Saul. He very graciously acceded to Saul's request and took him to the room. And so he's in the room, and just being in the room, he saw the parchments, and it says that um, despite his fever, Saul rejoiced, which is so beautiful. That even though he was feeling sick, and there's all of these emotions coming over him, he still manages to have that light, that little breakthrough, right? He was overcome by emotions, and he found the name of Abigail written many times on the little parchment, and there were phrases peculiar to his beloved's mannerisms, expressions and dates that coincided perfectly with her innermost revelations when both had enjoyed talking about the past and Zechariah's orchard. The word Corinth was also repeated many times. Those documents seemed to have a voice of their own. They spoke to his heart of a great and holy fraternal love. He listened in silence and ardently kept his conclusions to himself. So here we have feeling all the emotions, remembering Abby, right, and everything. And we can see how he's shifted a little bit now. He's even though he's experiencing powerful emotions, he's very mature, right, to kind of process everything he is feeling. And he would reveal to no one his inner pain. The great errors of his public life, his remorse, and his self corrections, which, although made openly, very few friends were able to comprehend. This was all others needed to know about. So, sometimes we have life, and, we have our own paths and our own way. So basically, here, nobody needed to know only what people needed to know. But there was other parts that he kept to himself, right? So that's another food for thought for us. A lot of people might not understand our path. We don't need to like give explanations and kind of thing. Like everything will work out beautifully. So that was touching. And he says here Peter noticed his attitude of constant meditation and made every effort to offer him his brotherly assistance, friendly words of encouragement, comments on the power of Jesus, nourishing broths, rich fruits, um, touched by care. So, what a great way to be a friend. So, that was beautiful, right? However, he noticed that James, son of Alphaeus, perhaps afraid of Saul's past actions, would not say one word to him. James had made himself a strict follower of the law of Moses within the Church of the Way, and Saul saw him only from time to time, an impassive shadow gliding among the sick, murmuring soundless prayers. At first, James' lack of interest hurt Saul. But soon he considered the need to humble himself before all. He had not yet done anything that would demonstrate his new convictions. When he had been a dominant figure in Sahedrin, he was unforgiven too. So he's again here kind of like, well, what's happening with James? He's different, right? So he's starting to perceive these things. Um, I personally said, the apostle thoughtfully, do not think it is very wise to stay in Jerusalem for now during this period of renewal. To be frank with you, um, and basically this whole says it's time for you to kind of leave for several reasons. One, you're going to cause a lot of, talk here. He has this very dark kind of, loud past that's very difficult to stay. But two, he needs place to grow. So they felt like for him to move was an option, right? Of course, Saul felt distressed as he listened to Peter's advice, but he didn't protest. The apostle was right. Throughout the city, he would meet with destructive and vile criticism. So here again, throughout this whole thing, Saul was like in another level. I think I should go back to Tarsus, he said humbly. Maybe my old father will understand the situation and help me out. I know Jesus will bless my efforts. If I must begin my life anew, I shall do it in the home that gave me birth. Simon contemplated him tenderly, surprised at that spiritual transformation. So they both engaged in conversations, and then we have here, as soon as he was able to get out of bed, he went to listen to the preachings in the same room. And this is where it starts to get a little bit interesting, right? Um, the preachers of the gospel were usually Peter and James. The former spoke with profound wisdom while making use of marvelous allegories. The latter, however, James, seemed tormented by Judaic influences. To most listeners, James gave the impression of having embarrassed Pharisaic rules. His preachings avoided the standard of freedom and love in Jesus. He showed he was imprisoned in these narrow minded concepts of the predominant Judaism. Long segments of his sermons refer to unclean meat, obligation towards the law, and the imperative of circumcision. The congregation also seemed completely different. The church looked much more like an ordinary synagogue. Israelites solemnly consulted parchments and papyri containing Moses' prescriptions. Saul looked in vain for the impressive presence of the sufferers and disinherited he had seen where he had got there for the first time. Highly curious, he noticed that Simon Peter was very kindly to tending to them in adjacent room. He got closer and saw that while the preaching reproduced the exact scenario found in the synagogues, there was a continuous flow of the afflicted to and from the former fisherman's humble room, right? So there was this change in seeing, like he was remembering the very first time when he went into the way, and there was more liveliness to it, and now more of that Christ the Nazarene teachings, and now it seems like they're kind of coming back to being like the law. So he's perceiving this, and he was shocked. The Church of the Way was completely different. Something was missing. The overall ambience seemed to be suffocating all notions of the Nazarene. He no longer found there had the great feeling of fraternity and the unification of principles for spiritual independence. After giving it some thought, he attributed all to Stephen's absence. And so this is like the next part is heavy because now he's having like this breakthrough and seeing things that he himself partook. It says, after his death, right, or Stephen's death, the power of gospel and freedom had been extinguished, for he had been the divine yeast of renewal. Only now was Saul able to evaluate the greatness of Stephen's exalted task. Like, wow, how they say, like, you never know what you have until you don't have it, right? Till you lose it. So now he's seeing, like, oh my gosh, like Stephen was special. So Saul wanted to speak as he had in Damascus, to lash out of the errors of interpretation, to shake out the dust that had accumulated over Christ's immense and sacred ideal. But he remembered Peter's advice and kept still. It was not right, for the time being, to reproach others' behaviors when he did not yet have any deeds, terrifying to his own renewal. So he's having this awakening, but he's also very patient with the process, knowing that he can't just come in, right? He has to slowly work his way through it. But nevertheless, the awakening is there. So if he tried to speak, he would receive like criticism, right? So also people knew what past he had, and so he needed to take it easy. So after that first meeting, Saul looked for an opportunity to be alone with Peter and to ask him about the changes. So now here it's like it's a very powerful piece, I think, because just as Emmanuel is giving us those details from the book, like the narration, the settings, and all of that, I think simultaneously we're also seeing Saul's own awakening and change of scene inside of him, and how it's so natural. It's not this thing of where he tries to push or make it over the top. It's just a very natural progress that I was very inspired, I have to say, with this part. But it's so beautiful because another part might be asking, well, if we know who he is and Saul's going to be, all of this, why is it that he's suffering so much? Why is it he's going through all these things, right? And in the Spirit's book, question 501, the question is, what is the role the spirits, uh, what, excuse me, let me start again. What is the role the spirits have in our lives covered? Why do they not openly protect and guide us, right? Because here we have from the first, second, and third parts together. um, on the surface, we might think, well, he's not getting any help. It seems like he's getting worse and worse. He finally goes to the way, and then they tell him you're gonna have to leave. Like, where is his protection? Where is his progress in this, right? But progress is not the way we see it. The spirits see progress like this. If you could count on your support, what you would not acquire experience or anything if only they did everything. Like, in other words, you have to put your part. You need to exercise your own power. Okay, the action of the spirits is regulated so that your free will is maintained. Without responsibility, you would not advance. So this is what we're seeing now. We're seeing Saul, even though he's on the surface, he's some difficulties, and he's finding more of God, and yet it seems like things are getting harder, but in actuality it's the other way around, because he is opening up and having an awareness, right? He's having those experiences for growth, and he's using his free will. So that was beautiful. And of course, the spirits book says, do spirits influence? Yes, he had a lot of influence in that part, but now we see it like the good spirits telling him, take it easy. You don't need to share every detail of your pain, or you also, when you saw those changes, right, those spirits, those mentors were like keeping him calm. It's relax, find your place, talk, you know be creative in how you approach, be tactful. And so all those things that we are seeing here, those minute details that Emmanuel throws at us, are actually huge, because this means that now he's in that vibration of the spirits, right? So I think that to end this whole part, I this was super interesting. It says here, the spirits tell us we wrongly assume that the spirits only manifest themselves through extraordinary phenomena. We would like to see them aid us through miracles, and we imagine them to be armed with some sort of magic wand. That's not the case, as their guidance is only through natural means, and their intervention usually takes place without are being aware of it. This is him. This is Saul, the whole part. He was actually, I feel like he was so embraced by spirituality. He was so loved. Um, but this extraordinary phenomena was in that little, I don't even know. It's like I was telling my friend earlier, there's certain things that I see in my head and it's so hard to express in words, but it's like, it is huge, but it doesn't need to be like over the top, right? It's more of the feeling and the emotion, like. And so I think that he's finally at that point where he's perceiving the spirits around him. He's seeing the advantage of these voices, these inspirations, or however we want to call them, that they're really helping him stay calm. He's finding healing as he was going through Abigail's thing. So, right. And then lastly, you know, by their fruits you will recognize. And we all know this, so we won't read the rest, but this is the Bible verse for reference. And I think that that's basically, we see the church scene right there in the Church of the Way, like by their fruits you will recognize them. And so we need to, we are going to get to that part of the book when we start to look at the church and their characteristics. But for now, we know that we do need to produce good fruit. And so that's kind of where he's at in the book. So those were my statements. And I apologize. Went to a refugee camp today, friends. All day. So I apologize. I feel myself speaking, but I'm so in tune. It's a beautiful, it was so beautiful. I'm wow. So
Thank you,
yes.
dear. It was beautiful. Thank you, bro. I have a couple of comments as well. A very interesting thing that we see in this part of the book is Saul of Tarsus constantly being put in a position where he needs to exercise humility. And when we look to those situations, we could pity him because it is not easy to be every single time he tries to find something to find some support, and then he has to go back and constantly being reminded about what he was in the past. This is not easy, and every single time we see that he has this mental attitude where he reminds himself that he has to be humble. I want to act like that, but I remember that I have to be humble. I have to exercise humility, and to not feel pity towards him, to not see him in that position of someone who is being a victim or who is suffering some kind of injustice. We do need to recognize that we as spirits, although we are incarnated on earth, we receive here what we need as spirits. Sometimes it is really harsh, but having that in our minds really helps us to go through those harsh times and go through them with faith and believing that God has a plan, and that will help us to have this more um, how can I put this? But this more equilibrated mental attitude, and therefore pass every single thing without harming ourselves in multiple terms. Another thing that I think is very interesting in this part of the book is that we see two men who are really different, and spoil alert, but they will have loads of issues because of these differences. We see James, and Norah brought these words, very connected to the obligations toward the law, and we see a man who was all about the law, but now he's all about Jesus Christ. He's 100% different. And it's really interesting because a couple of times as spiritists, we think that knowing the doctrine, and as spiritists, we do believe that the doctrine is the most honest perspective of Christianity. But of course we respect everybody that thinks differently. But these differences between them shows us that even though you are touching Christ, you are very close to him in this formal ways, because James was there. He saw Christ. He was one of the apostles, one of the 12 apostles. He was there. But if you do not have an open heart, you won't be able to deliver, as Noah brought, the fruits that you are supposed to deliver. And in the other hand, we have this man that did not know Christ at first, but got to know Jesus in a very different perspective. But he was with open hearts. And as we've talked from day one, he was honest. He was always defending the Judaism because he truly believed that that was the truth. And now that he thinks that Jesus carries everything that is worth on earth, he defends that. It's really interesting when we see them and bring to nowadays and think about spiritism, because a couple of times we have much ways of knowing the doctrine, and we have multiple opportunities when it comes to knowing nice people in spiritism, having access to beautiful books, and yet we um, we see and we find people, especially here in Brazil, that can't even read, people that literally can read, and they profess spiritism in a very different and honest and truthful way. This is beautiful, and we see that it's not about having the possibility to touch these amazing things, even touching Jesus at all. It's about having an open heart. And this is what I having an open heart talk to you guys tonight is in the Spirit's book, question number 655. Allan Kardec asks, is it wrong to practice a religion that is not believed in from the bottom of the heart if it is done out of human respect and in order not to offend these who think differently? And here we see James, totally James in this question. The answer, the elevated spirits answered. As in so many other things, the intent is the rule. Those whose sole aim is to show respect for the beliefs of others do no wrong. In fact, they do better than those who would ridicule such beliefs, since that would show a lack of charity. However, those who practice a religion out of ulterior motives or ambition are contemptible in the sight of God and humankind. God could not be pleased with those who only put on a show of humility in order to gain the approval of others. And it's really interesting because we've seen that James, when it comes to professing this respect that he had gained ultimately about Judaism, he was actually aiming for some kind of um, it's not vanity the word. Um, I don't find the word here in English, but he was trying to get something in terms of materialism out of it. It was not from the bottom of his heart. And we see a huge difference when it comes to Saul of Tarsus, who now really believes that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, and will do every single thing in his power to defend his new faith. Do you guys wanna say something, bro?
Yes, about what you said, we can imagine Saul in that position. He was once a very arrogant, powerful man who would never think twice if he needed to go vicious against his enemies, so-called enemies. And then he was then in need, profoundly, in a profoundly humiliating situation, having to ask his former enemies for help, and talking about the very same master that he fought. And then some might say, well, that's what he deserved. Deserved to suffer all these situations, these humiliations, such as you told us. But in that part, when Peter, oh no, Barnabas was talking to Saul, and he said, Jesus helped us all because we need it, not because we deserve it. So it's not a matter of deserving to be humiliated, but that's what he needed. And it's a, as you said about the reading the Spirit's book, the intent is the rule. So uh, the same thing is happening to a person, but you can see the different cause for that. The cause makes all the difference, and you can like that um, notice how God operates changes in our lives. It's so wise and so subtle that we are most likely to dismiss and ignore his actions. Another part that I would like to point out is that an expression I don't know about uh, U.S., but in Brazil we have this expression having one foot back. It's like you don't fully engage into something. You don't fully get into a room and participate and compromise with something. So having a foot back means uh, that you will hold back everything that you are, that you think, that you feel, and you won't participate in what is going on. And we see Saul in that situation, that meeting at the Church of the Way. Saul was facing imminent rejection, and even though he had the courage to go in and to open his heart, to put all the cards on the table, and Peter to uh, control and bring a new energy to that meeting, he opened his heart and and talked about some painful, really painful and shameful mistakes he did uh, in that sacred opportunity to be with Jesus. So they put the cards over the table. They were open-hearted, and this is exactly the opposite of having one foot back. And this phrase touched me very deeply. Goodness can't be held back by fear. And to these days we are living, and all we see on TV and social media, I want to add no resentment, because resentment is taking over human relationships, and everything bad that we are seeing in social media is how can I say this, is stained by resentment. Resentment is everywhere, and we are holding back our goodness, because if we compare um, our society nowadays to 2,000 years ago, we can clearly see that we now desire goodness more, much more, incomparably more than we did at that time. We are so far from perfection, but we desire a world full of goodness, with open-hearted, with open hearts. But we all have, most of all, have one foot back, willing not to be hurt, not to be deceived, and we are opening wounds. And we are also preventing wounds to be healed. And this is so interesting. What we see in those spirits living in that book, I always point that out. They were so much more intelligent than we could expect from people from 20 centuries ago. That's mesmerizing, you know. So that's it. Thanks.
I totally agree. Dear, do you have something to say?
Sure. Just to kind of what you're saying, Daniel, regarding time and change. I was reading a chapter from a book that talks about the Mexican American community here in the United States and how maybe about 150 years ago, between 100 and 150 years ago, um, this ethnicity, this ethnic group was in a certain place. And then today, the youth, the Mexican American youth here in this country, they have more opportunities. There's still a lot of um, things that are needed, but there's this growth. And the title of this book was uh, From Pain to Growth, or Growth Pains, right? And um, talking about this in a study with other students, we realized that even though that was in an academic setting, we could think about it in life too. You know, if there was no pushover, if there were none of these little things, this community wouldn't have grown. So imagine us to, spiritually speaking, right? We cannot, and the interesting thing was one of the activities we had to do, instead of focusing on being the victims of this pain, right? Myself here too, this Mexican American community here. We've gone through so many things, right? And instead of focusing on that, we focus on the spirit of renewal, of problem solving. Like, what can we do from here on? If we've come this far, what can we do moving forward? And I feel like using that back to Saul's situation, I feel like he too had a choice about whether he wanted to stay stuck. And I thought, to be honest with you, the very first time that he wanted to be in Stephen's room and he kind of wanted to be there and saw Abigail's, stuff, I said, "Oh my gosh, brother, are we going back? Like, what's happening?" But actually, he came out of that and just moved forward, at least from this part. And I think that that's beautifully said, Daniel, as far as, yes, even in our society, we're growing, he's growing, and just him being open to it. I always feel like in this part, when I was reading, there was a lot of behind the scenes stuff happening because his like you said, João, that passion that he had when it was for the law, now for Christianity, for being a Jesus disciple, that's very special. Like, that's unique and that's something, right? And so when someone has that gift, we have to think about the spirituality, like the world trying to, you know like, no, it can't happen, right? Because he has a special mission. And so for sure, like, we can already see it, just those thinking processes. Again, part of his growth is the spirituality, protecting that, because he had that mission and it needed to be like protected. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I was very touched by this part. Yeah.
Totally. You're totally making sense. Thank you both. Guys,
Mm,
before we finish, I just wanted to just want to know, I just want to bring one last
sure.
perception. As we've seen, this man, he is being at this part of the book, but every single time in positions where he have to exercise his humility. But another thing is that he was a very self-centered man, as we've seen before. It was all about himself. And now we're seeing a Saul of Tarsus asking to lay on the bed that Stephen used. This is very powerful because he is absolutely telling that he is not the selfish man anymore. And he is being put again in positions where he needs to exercise that type of mental attitude. And in this sense, we have a very important question in the Spirit's book. And I want to finish with that question that brings us why we have to go through that kind of process. It's a very nice question. And for you guys that are started reading the Spirit's book, at this part of the book, when the spirits start talking more about the moral things, um, it really worth what I want to say here is it's really worth to go all read all the book, go from the beginning to the last word. This is very powerful. So we have question 917, and Allan Kardec asked the superior spirits, what is the means for destroying selfishness? They answered, of all human imperfections, the most difficult to uproot is selfishness because it is connected to the influence of matter from which human beings is still so close to their origin cannot free themselves. Everything conquers to sustain its influence, your laws, your social organizations, and your education. Selfishness will be weakened with the predominance of the moral life over the material life, and especially with the understanding that Spiritism gives you concerning your true future state, which is no longer distorted by allegorical fictions. When it is well understood and identified with customs and beliefs, Spiritism will transform habits, usages, and social relations. Selfishness is founded upon the importance of the personality. When well understood, I repeat, Spiritism enables you to see things from such an evolved point of view that the sentiment of the personality somehow disappears before the doctrine's immensity. Upon destroying the self importance and showing its real nature, Spiritism necessarily combats selfishness. If it is the shock that humans experience from the selfishness of others that usually makes them selfish in turn because they feel the need to put themselves on the defensive, seeing that others think only of themselves and not of them, they are in turn led to be concerned about themselves more than about others. Let the principle of charity and fraternity be the basis of social institutions and the legal relations between nations and individuals, and all will think less of themselves and when they see that others are doing so too. Thus, they will undergo the moralizing influence of example and contact. In the light of the present overflowing of selfishness, true virtue is needed to sacrifice one's own personality for the sake of others. This is really meaningful, who generally do not recognize it. It is to those, above all, who possess this virtue that the kingdom of heaven is opened. For them, specially, is reserved the bliss of the elect, because I can truly tell you that on the day of judgment, those who have only thought of themselves will be cast aside and will suffer abandonment. This is a message by Felanin. Guys, this is really interesting because, as we've seen before, we have in this book Abigail and Stephen, and they were at all not selfish, and we had and that first Saul of Tarsus. And at this point of the book, we have James and we have this renewal Saul of Tarsus, and he will be the example of a person who is getting rid of his selfishness. This is very powerful. And with the Spirit's book, we see how important getting rid of selfishness and all its problems that it brings to our lives. How important is that? I'm finished tonight. Do you guys want to say something else before we close the live?
Just that there was a parts of me that I wanted to hug Saul. I really felt like he was getting his lessons. And so I was like, oh, just hugging him. And even though it's hard and he's going through those pains, they're gonna have a purpose. So, and thank you, friends.
Bro, do you want to say something?
No, thanks, guys. Nora, what you said about focusing on solutions, it brought me some memories about the therapy I went once, and I thought the psychologist would tell me what was wrong about my childhood, about the times when I was a teenager, but no, she was always asking me the same question: what can you do to change that? What can you do? What to change what's hurting you? So it's precisely this thinking. Focus on the solutions. That's so important. And thanks, guys. It's been always a pleasure.
Thank you guys so much. I want to thank everybody that's here with us, that's accompanying the studies on demand. Thank you guys so much. I'm very satisfied and grateful. We're going to be here next week. God bless. Thank you, my two friends, and thank everybody that's here with us. See you guys next week, okay? Bye bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye, João. Bye, Nora.
Bye bye.